All right, so kicking off a conversation today with Michael Martin, who's written a very fantastic series of books going into Sophiology, which if anybody who's been watching us in our conversations, is something we've been kicking around for a while now. And his most recent book is called Sophia in Exile, which I'm sure we'll get into a good bit of. But he's also the editor of a journal called Jesus the Imagination. How often does that publish, Michael?
Once a year.
Once a year,
yeah.
Which is really interesting compendium of thinkers that I think most folks tuning into our conversations would be interested in as well. So yeah, I'll kick it over to you, Nate, if you have any questions you want to start off with.
Yeah, so the latest book is called Sophia in Exile. So I think the best question to start off with is if you could tell our listeners, like, who is Sophia and why is she in exile?
Oh, is that all? Well, I wrote this book because, I started to write this book because I realized I left some things undeveloped in the Submerged Reality, in particular, especially the relationship to Gnosticism. And in the interim, I encountered the work of Margaret Barker, which, she confirmed a lot of my intuitions, and she does it in a kind of a biblical archaeological way. So that was kind of exciting to discover her. And I don't know how I didn't bump into her before, but just didn't happen. So having done that, I wanted to investigate Gnosticism a little bit more. Because I've always been fascinated with the mythos of Gnosticism. I could never quite figure it out. It's so unwieldy, and there's so many different varieties of Gnosticism. So it's kind of, until you get a decent grounding, it's like learning a new language. You have to be oriented to it. Gosh, what was it? A year and 2 years ago, probably, I decided it was time to investigate. And that led, then COVID hit. And I thought, because I was teaching part-time at a local liberal arts college, I said, oh, great, I'll have all this time at home. I'll be able to write the rest of the book. But I didn't. So I didn't until actually school started again. So about a year ago, September, I wrote the chapter on marriage as a sociological structure of marriage, and then eventually did the other ones. But usually I work really quickly. I think I wrote the Submerged Reality in about 6 weeks. But this one was quickly after a year and a half hiatus. But I realized as I was writing it that it's more personal than any of my other books, with the exception of the poetry, because this one has a lot of autobiography in it. Mm-hmm. But it's not autobiographical, but a lot of my concerns in my life become characters or symbols in this book, including my children, some of my children, my daughter May in particular, and my wife, because of this meditation on marriage. I can't meditate on marriage without thinking of my wife of almost 30 years. So it was exciting. But Sophia, in the way, to my understanding, is if you know Proverbs 8, right, with when wisdom speaks and she's participating in the creation of all things with God. And so to me, and this is Margaret Barker, this is what she confirmed for me, and she confirmed for Vladimir Soloviev and the Philadelphians and Jakob Burma, who all had the same intuition, which is interesting. In fact, you can even say David Bentley Hart comes upon the same intuition, right? Because I just edited one of his books for Angelico Press, and he's he's doing Sophiology. I'm sorry, that's what he's doing.
Oh, for sure. And Rolling in Moonlight, it really comes out. Like,
yeah.
It's oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. It's like really.
I edited that one too, and
that.
And I think universalism, that he's really a proponent of. You see the same thing in those Sophiologists like not Burma so much, but in Jade Lead in particular, and the Russian Sophiologist. It's all over, Bulgakov, it's all over the place. So that's Sophia, but also the Virgin Mary for me is the incarnation of Sophia. Because if you think about it, in Proverbs 8, where she is in the role of the co-creator with God, or the handmaid of God, right? The assistant. And what does she say at Luke's in Luke's gospel at Gabriel's greeting? Behold, the handmaid of the Lord. So I think what's happening in Luke is that she's participating in the recreation of the world there, just as Sophia participates in the creation of the world in Proverbs. And there's a Belgian theologian. He had been a Benedictine. This is in the 1920s, 30s. His name was Alexander von Moosbrugge, I think is pronounced. And he wrote a book which is hard to find. I made a photocopy years ago called From Dyad to Triad. And in that book, and I reference this a lot in my own books, he reads Genesis when God says, let us create man in our image, male and female created he them, that God is speaking to Sophia, which to me that's tremendously healing to gendered typology, and there's all kinds of implications for Christianity going forward from that kind of insight. So that's kind of in a nutshell who Sophia is to me and why I wrote the book.
Yeah, just to play off of what you were saying, like this is like one of the things that's occurred to me for quite some time is that in light of what you were saying, in terms of Genesis, that God is speaking to Sophia. There's sort of like the Trinity almost seems to be an obvious family analogically, and it seems like our understanding of our failure to understand the Trinity in that way, and particularly the Spirit, which we have very little grasp of. Right. It's like the most elusive part of the Trinity. And I think it's because we haven't leaned into that familial analogical understanding, which will require that the Spirit be understood as being analogically feminine.
Right, but the fathers were kind of androcentric, right? It was their culture. I mean, they couldn't believe that could be the truth. Right? So that's what I think happened. Yeah. And I think a lot of the problems of the church over the millennia has been due to that category error. Right.
And to be clear, what you're talking about is you're talking about a recognition of the importance of the feminine as such, as opposed to what our culture does, which is it's actually even its feminism is actually hypermasculinity, because it's just elevation of the things that we consider masculine, right, applied to both genders.
So women get to be like dudes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's not it's a horrible, right?
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you for that. So that's Sophia. So how would you, I know I've heard you define this before, but I'll give you a chance to say it to our audience. How would you define Sophiology? What's your best way of defining it?
Well, as much as I hate definitions, I think I think what happens with the definition is people get stuck on it then, right? Yeah. You feel married to it. Like getting a master's degree when you're 23 and then really discovering later that you don't want to do this for a living. Yeah. So, but Sophiology, the way I understand it, is a kind of attentiveness to the world that that allows what is present behind phenomena to disclose itself. So that's what's one way. And so for me, then, Sophiology is intimately connected to the natural world, to creation. And so, which is why some people describe me as an ecologist, which I never would occurred to me. But I read a review recently that said the farmer and ecologist, Michael Martin, which wow, am I? So I told my wife, hey, look it, check it out, I'm an ecologist. So but I think what's important about that is so Sophia, as both a handmaid of God and as Virgin Mary, makes the divine palpable to human senses, right? So with Mary in the person of Christ, so the divine becomes available to the senses through the incarnation. And it's the same thing, I think, through the attendance to phenomena and the relationship of us, not only to the created world, which I think, and so it's a kind of a simultaneous connection to the created world and to the spiritual world at the same time. So those two orders are intimately connected. And it's also manifests in community, right? And whether it's in a church community, and I don't mean parish community, at least not how parishes typically function now, which are very often, I don't know about your experience, cold, uninviting places, and very often. I mean, you can find people. We have had luck at finding at times a nice community, but it's not connected. It's disconnected usually from creation. And that part of why I think the Anglicans and Episcopalians do a lot of things that are goofy, but I think they preserve that Catholic tradition of Lammas, for instance. You know, there's a wonderful video of you on YouTube of Alison Milbank.
Yes, I've seen it. It's great.
On Lammas bread. It's fantastic. Yeah. And that's why I asked her to write for Jesus the Imagination, because I saw that. I said, this is be the perfect person to write for Jesus the Imagination, because she's right there. And in her article in Jesus the Imagination, the Divine Feminine, she writes about the charisms of a female priesthood. She's an Episcopal or an Anglican priest, and she writes about them from the point of view of a woman. And when she sent it to me, she said, this is going to make a lot of my fellow priests angry, because because in the Anglican orders, I guess they like to pretend that the priesthood is gender neutral, but that's a tragedy. And so here's Alison writing from the point of view of a woman who's a priest, a woman who has given birth, and who compares a baptism to giving a child a bath, a baby, an infant, his first bath, right? So Sophiology kind of touches on all this kind of stuff. And also the arts and the sciences, because I think it's really intimately connected to the intuitions of phenomenology. So in particular with
you talk about that a lot in Incarnation of the Poetic Word.
I talk about that a lot generally, but especially in Incarnation of the Poetic Word, I had a Jones for phenomenology right then. Really, I got a fever for phenomenology. But so I think it starts with Goethe in his scientific method, where he really despised what he called the empirical dogmatic torture chamber of the science of his time, and our own science, where objects of nature are submitted to torture. So which is the exact language they used in the 17th century. Let's torture nature to make her reveal her secrets to us. So it's a language of rape, right? But Goethe went to what he called a delicate empiricism and allowed phenomena to speak. Didn't impose a meaning on them, but allowed phenomena to disclose themselves. And later, Edmund Husserl picked up on that, and of course Rudolf Steiner picked up on it. And Husserl called phenomenology first science. And I think you can also call it first theology or first philosophy, because that is, and somebody writing about, I think they were writing about Incarnation of the Poetic Word, they called it an atheoretical theory, because I didn't want to impose a theory on works of literature. I wanted to let the works of literature open themselves to me, and that shouldn't be that weird. But if you spend any time in an English department in a university, you realize how weird that is, because the English departments that I've been around, they typically want to impose a meaning onto works of literature, whether they're calling it post-colonial or they're taking a Marxist interpretation or whatever it happens to be, and that always struck me as inherently phony and disrespectful of the work of art in front of one, right? So that's what I tried to develop in that book. And that also is the literary criticism version of a delicate empiricism. And I tell this story in a couple, I think definitely in Incarnation of the Poetic Word, of Simone Weil, who was given a book of poetry by the metaphysical poets. And my doctorate is in 16th and 17th century English literature. So the metaphysical poets are kind of my bread and butter, and which is how I bumped into this quote from her. And she said that, she used to get these migraines, and she translated one of George Herbert's poems into French. And every time she felt a migraine coming on, she would start to recite it to herself. And she writes in a letter to a priest, she says, after a while, these recitations took on the virtue of a prayer. And it was during one of these recitations, she said, that Christ himself came down and took possession of me. So I think that's important. I think when we attend to things, this case, work of literature, I think so I'm attending to the poetry of Henry Vaughan or Thomas Traherne. But I think you really have the experience if you've saturated yourself enough in that person's poetry or writing anyway, that the person starts to be disclosed to you. You realize this person. It's an intimate experience, this reading. But then, especially in the cases with Traherne and Herbert and metaphysical poets, I think Czesław Miłosz, when their subject is the divine, a kind of an interesting thing happens. First, the epoche, the resistance to forming a judgment about what you're reading, allows first the poet to appear. But then in those cases where it's like what happened with Simone Weil, it was not only the poet who appeared, but the subject of the poet's work who appeared. And I think we've all had that experience. Maybe not through poetry, but through nature or through liturgy or through all kinds of things where something reveals itself.
Well, I can say, just like on a very personal note, like just reading your books, like your writing style is very interesting to me, because you have this way of going from like a very scholarly discussion to transition to the use of like very folksy colloquial kind of language. That was exactly the kind of thing that my writing instructors in college tried to beat out of me, because I had the same tendency. It's like, no, you can't do that. Like, that's mixed voice. That's awful writing. You shouldn't do that. But it gives your work, like, so to me, it just like gives it an authenticity that I immediately identified with.
Well, yeah, I mean, academics try to recreate the world in their image, right? So, and it's horrible. It's horrible writing usually too.
Right.
But
yeah, it really is.
I wanted to write things that were human. In fact, a long time ago, I wrote an article for the Midwest Quarterly on Romanticism. And when I wrote it, I wanted to write it as a work of romanticism while still a scholarly work on romanticism. Because the whole idea with romanticism is not to think you're some kind of objective scientist dissecting, we murder to dissecting this work of literature. But romanticism, the thing is, you're participating in the thing you're celebrating, whether it's Wordsworth or Keats.
Right. And it comes across that because of that, it comes across that you're very much you're not just talking about this academically because you find it academically interesting. It's like you're seeing something here that like you want to communicate because you see that it matters in the world. That particularly comes through in your book Transfiguration. So the next question I would like to ask you is like, so we've kind of like talked about who Sophia is and what Sophiology is. But why does Sophiology matter, and how can we apply it in the world?
Well, I mean, not to be cocky, but it matters because it can save the world. It matters because we live lives of insanity. Our culture is completely insane, and Sophiology offers us a way to enter into the real. Whether in whatever domain, whether it's science or the arts, farming, literature, it allows us to enter into that, and even the economics. I see a lot of this. I mean, where I live, we live in rural Michigan on a small biodynamic farm, and the question for me for the last 20 or 30 years is how can we form communities that are more health giving and not deadening, not characterized by the political and technological zeitgeist of whatever era, right? And so that's why when I wrote Transfiguration, I thought of it as a kind of a practical guide to Sophiology, at least first steps toward that. In fact, that came out of in 2016, right after we moved to this farm. I announced on Facebook, I want to have a conference, and people are invited. So I invited a bunch of people to a conference on my farm, and a bunch of people came. My wife was a little freaked out. Are you sure these people are going to be normal? Are they not going to be any weirdos? Like, we're going to be okay. And for the most part, we were okay. And at that, we had conversations around all the topics in Transfiguration, on science, on the arts, on the economy, on what else is in there? I'll tell you. I got it right here. So what else did I do? So yeah, science. It's a science, art, education. That was an important one. Economy, and the Sophia and Ahriman, or the wrestling against the technological age. So for me, those were all very practical things, like what could we do to fix this now, or to at least to address this now. And it doesn't have to be some kind of mass movement or anything.
I love what you said on Twitter yesterday about like how the left just keeps waiting around for like a political messiah.
Oh yeah,
and it's like, and it's like I had just the previous evening, I had a conversation with a longtime friend of mine, who's like kind of an old school leftist, and it's like that's what we were talking about. I'm like look, it's like why does government need to have a monopoly on human cooperation? Like why do we need to look to the state for community building and human cooperation? Like why can't people who have the same desire and see the same vision just do things?
Yeah, that's my thing, is just start doing it, right?
Yeah.
So and worry about how well we're, because I think people want to have a whole schematic drawn out already, and we'll implement this once we're elected to office. Yeah, that's never going to happen. So so my thing, and I wrote a blog about this recently, inspired by Václav Havel, why can't we think about it in terms of a parallel polis?
Oh,
right. So we just start doing our own thing.
Yeah.
And don't worry about it, And so, for instance, you may see I posted this on Twitter yesterday. We went to we live about 1.5 miles away from this kind of farm museum we have here in Waterloo Township, Michigan. And they had they called it Pioneer Days. So you go there and it's really educational for the kids. So you have people doing reenactment stuff, right? So there was a French and Indian War guy who was talking about trapping and about the area. There were other things, but they were also doing sheep shearing and other kinds of traditional crafts, right? So it's very cool. But so these people, and there was a potter there. Potter lives about 2 miles away from me. So I was there and I bought a butter bell from him because we have a cow.
It was beautiful. I saw the picture.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The guy does great work.
Yeah.
And just little things like that, you can kind of you start to build this. And we do the same thing here at the farm with the Christian festivals. We don't do them all, but we have a big one for May Day, which is, I guess, technically not a Christian festival, but it is for us. And we just did Michaelmas a couple weeks ago. We also do 12th night. So, and we also do a smaller version for St. John's Day where we jump over the fire and stuff like this. But we try to cultivate this sense of community that in which the cosmic year and the liturgical year are intertwined, but it's also fun for the kids because I years ago, my oldest son is 31, and I remember thinking, what are we going to do to make this relevant to the children? Because remember going to church when you were a kid? God help us.
Mm-hmm.
How long does this last, right?
Yeah.
So how can we make the sacred alive to children? And so that's one of the things. And for me, it has to do with a lot of conviviality. So there's a lot, there's all kinds of things that for me that are kind of intertwined with this sophiological idea, and like in Transfiguration, how do we make it alive, right? How do we make it not dead? Like in the chapter I wrote on the Sophiological Hedge School, which now I have a place to do it. I spent half the summer, actually the whole summer, building a yurt here on my farm. And my plan is to start doing classes out there in the spring, doing classes for homeschool parents, like giving them, because I know I was a Waldorf teacher, so I have all these methods I could share them with how to teach geometry, how to teach mathematics in a creative and alive way. But also people have been asking me to just do a hands-on how to do gardening, farming class. So I think you can form this parallel polis if you just do it.
Yeah.
And not wait for other people. This is what was driving me crazy is my years in academia, and like the Marxists would drive me insane because they hated the proletariat. They had such contempt for the working class, and they didn't want to do anything. They just wanted to complain.
Mm.
Then nobody actually did anything to make anybody's lives better. They just went to Starbucks and bitched,
Yeah.
And I see the same thing around with our beloved Christian socialist types, who keep waiting for the political messiah to show up.
Yeah.
And it's always changing. They always say, maybe it's this guy. I don't know if you've ever read Jacques Derrida on the non-arrival of the Messiah.
Yeah.
They're like him, and they're like, well, he says, I want the Messiah to come, but you know what? I kind of like my life how it is, so don't want him to come. At least not today. Someday.
Oh, yeah, but that's it. But Michael, you really, that's something important right there, because it's what do they really want? Because it's easy as long as you're just talking in the realm of ideological principles, but to actually build something would require you to do something, would require you to actually engage in effort on your own, would require you to actually start making some sacrifices in order to implement what you see in the world,
and to possibly fail too, right?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, so that's why I wrote that book.
Yeah.
Because I said, it's, what did I call it? Notes toward, right?
Right.
It's not a handbook. It's just a preliminary sketch of what could be possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the advice that you use in that book of like the start where you are.
Yeah.
Advice. It's like, I mean, it's like maybe, I mean, if you live in like a big city, like, maybe just starting with like growing some plants in your window is the best you can manage.
And that's enough, man. That's enough. When we started, my gosh, we were living in a rental in suburban Detroit. I had a little garden. I mean, it was the tiniest garden, and it just kept, that was 30 years ago. And then it just, after a few years, we got to to a double lot in the city. So we had a bigger garden. And then we bought a small 2-acre farm, and then we moved here, which is, we're on 10 acres here. But it just, slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah.
How big is your farm, Sherry?
Pardon?
How big is your farm?
We have 160 acres.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so much of what you have just been talking about is just like resonating. Like, I feel like church bells are going off in my head at the moment. But just on that more recent topic of start where you are, my husband and I have had, I'm sure you're familiar with the woofing program, Michael? Woof?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we've had woofers for years here, and they would come in, and often urban dwelling people, lots of Europeans, and I mean, they're urban dwelling because they just don't have a choice. They have to, they can't afford to buy a house and
Right.
a piece of land in Europe, and their way of doing something was not eating meat, buying organic in the grocery store, stuff like that. And so I would address those things as them actually not being, those are not participatory,
No.
right?
Well,
So,
it's
and
consumerism. Yeah.
right, it's just a nice label that makes you feel good. And so I'd say to them, well, don't stop eating meat. Go to a local farmer and buy meat from him so that he can keep raising them the right way. Right.
Right.
And then the animals have a good life. And then I would say, and if you don't have a balcony, use window boxes on all the windows that open and plant everything you can, anything you can, all your herbs, anything that climbs, and I haven't read Transfiguration. I have it right here. See.
You didn't prove it.
You don't need to read it, Sherry. You live it.
I didn't know that it was about what you just talked about. And it makes sense to me now, the title, because when you do that, you will be transformed. Like you don't have, there's no choice. You don't have a choice in that, right? It'll happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me, and I would join these groups on Facebook, like the Distributist group or whatever it was called. And then, people would post nice stories about the Hobbit or whatever. And then I finally asked the question to the whole group, said, do any of you actually belong to a CSA or a herd share or anything like that? And they're, oh God, no, I can't afford that. I go to Walmart. And I'm like, ugh.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so do you have a CSA at your place?
No, my husband has a market garden.
Okay.
So my husband is Swiss, and we lived in Switzerland. I moved there when we got married. I'm Canadian. And we lived there for 11 years with always keeping in mind that we would one day move to Canada. And I kind of grew up rurally and just not a city dweller. So when we moved to Canada, we moved to the far north of British Columbia, just below the Yukon border. And we homesteaded there, and we just did self-sufficient farming. So we had goats and chickens and a big garden, and traded with the Indians, literally, for vegetables and berries and fish and moose and.
Oh, wonderful.
And we did that for 3 years, and then the schooling posed a problem because when my oldest daughter got into high school age, she had to go away, and it was like a 3-day journey to get to her. So I didn't want that to happen with the other two, because I really missed out on her, 16 to 18, like her last 2 years of high school. So we moved to where we are now in 2000, and we just continued self-sustaining. And because we were growing for the whole year, we had a big garden, right? And then the kids all grew up and left. And my husband's like standing out there, his hands on his hips, going, what am I doing with all this food?
Yeah.
So he started going to the farmer's market.
Okay.
And he's been doing that for about 10 years now. And then we kept goats. I'm kind of I'm the livestock manager, So we had Highland cows, we had a dairy herd but just for ourselves. We tried selling the meat locally, but this is ranching country, and nobody wanted to pay anything for their meat. So it just wasn't worth it for us. And so we just did that for ourselves. But we did the garden for the farmer's market.
Nice.
Everything else was self-sustaining. And now I raise sheep, and I don't raise them for meat though, because we've gotten soft in our old age and we just can't do it anymore.
Wow.
I don't have a ram. I keep a flock for their fleeces, and I spin. So
My wife keeps threatening to get sheep.
it's
We
not
have
a bad
cows.
bet.
We have cows and hogs and bees and chickens
Yeah.
and ducks and something else.
Yeah, we did pigs too. Yeah, but sheep are actually wonderful. They're really great. I love them. I said to my husband, I don't know why I didn't do this sooner, because goats can drive you crazy.
Goats do drive you crazy. We had goats. That's why we have a cow.
Yeah.
They have an attitude problem.
And they're super athletic.
Yeah.
They get under every single fence.
Mhm.
We had goats for 23 years. So yeah, I was a goat person for forever, but now I'm a sheep person. Yeah, but like Nate introduced me to Sophiology, right? Through our interactions here on this channel and as a group of friends. And I read Sophiology of Death by Bulgakov, and I'm just like, this is everything I ever talk about. Nate said, Sherry, this is your chapter, And the only explanation I don't think I'm someone special at all. I just think that the only explanation for it is the life I live. That's the thing that transforms, right? And that's where you have that communion with Sophia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what about us city folks? What's your
There's hope for
do you
you
have
yet.
advice for city slickers like me and Michael?
City Sophiologists?
Yeah, well, Solovia was a city slicker.
Mm-hmm.
What was that?
Solovia was a city slicker.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So was Jane Led,
Yeah.
the Philadelphian Society.
Mm. My advice is always just simply get your hands dirty. Like
What?
And Bulgakov.
just get your hands dirty.
Yeah.
Bulgakov was an economist and then a priest in Paris.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not city slicker material, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that's not agricultural material. He's a city slicker,
Right.
but for him, it happened through the arts.
Yeah, I
and
was
through
just thinking
nature.
that.
He writes about in his autobiography. He writes about seeing this beautiful sunset when he was crossing the steppes by train, and he realized that there was something beyond the material there. And also his experience with the Sistine Madonna in Dresden. He was
Yeah.
for there for a while. In fact, that's why, I don't know if you noticed, but you can't see, but in this guy, that's actually the Sistine Madonna.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. It's a lovely cover, by the way. I really liked
Thanks.
it.
And I was insistent to the designer that we use that image because it's such an important image in the history of Sophiology. Not only
Right.
with Bulgakov, Novalis, Goethe. In
Yeah.
fact, if you read Goethe's Faust at the end, where the mother of glory, the Mater Gloriosa, comes and offers Faust, who had been kind of a screw up, dispensation, and universalism is what it is, right? And also it was integral to Rudolf Steiner's thinking about things. It's such an important image. In fact, Novalis, if you ever read his poem, Hymns to the Night.
I started it.
It's so beautiful. And there's I don't like the George MacDonald translation too much, but there's another one by, I can't remember the guy's name, which is just gorgeous. And it's a kind of a place where a kind of sfumato happens, where Novalis's biography and his deceased fiance and the Virgin Mary and Sophia and the Sistine Madonna all kind of coalesce, and like in a dream, they change hands in a way. It's just extraordinary. Some of the foundational documents of modern poetry.
Sorry. I do have a question though, about Sophia. You know, I haven't read the book, but Sophia in Exile, but there is an element to Sophia that is hidden, right?
Right.
And well, not an element. It is hidden. It is hidden, and I'm wondering what the utility, or if you have an idea of what the utility of that is, of that hiddenness, because there must be a utility in it.
And that's the first chapter is entitled Sophia in Exile, and it starts off as a meditation on the Gnostic myth, where she's kind of, in fact, David Hart's new book, it's going to be called Kino Gaia, is actually based on a Gnostic myth. The Hymn of the Pearl. You ever read the Hymn of the Pearl? It's beautiful. You can find really, it's not very long. It's only about 5 pages long, 6 pages long. You can find it on the internet for free. And I make my college students read it, because what it is, it's about it's a fairy tale where the son of the king is sent into Egypt to retrieve a pearl that's near a dragon. But what happens is he gets to Egypt and he starts to eat their food, and he forgets why he was sent. And and then he doesn't know who he is anymore. So I make the college students read it, because that's basically what happens when you go off into the world, right? And Terrence Malick, in his film Knight of Cups, have you seen it?
Haven't seen that either.
It's beautiful, but he uses that as a kind of narrative scaffolding
Okay.
for his story, which his takes place in Hollywood, in kind of modern day Hollywood. But it's the same idea, right? That you forget who you are, and we all forget who we are.
Right.
So in the Gnostic myth, it's Sophia falls asleep, and so then the idea is that she's asleep. But I think when I've teased it out, it's not really, she's not the one who's asleep, it's us. So when we become attentive to her, or her presence in nature or liturgy or literature, whatever, she awakens. Well, it seems like she awakens, but it's really we who have awakened. So there's kind of reciprocity here.
Right. It seems to me almost, and tell me maybe I'm crazy, but it seems to me it's like the Sophia in the world awakens the Sophia within us, which is the divine part of us, which is that which is breathed into us by God.
Right.
So it's like we need that participatory interaction in order to wake up, basically.
Yeah. Well, the Irish philosopher William Desmond calls it the metaxu, the between, right? Yeah. And so Sophia is like this between, this conduit or catalyst between the created order and the divine order. And I think that's what happens is when we encounter the Sophianic in the world, it's kind of at once awakens the Sophianic in us. And I think that happens when, remember one time I took my kids to, we don't live very far from University of Michigan, and now you have to wear masks and be inoculated. But before, you could go there to see these concerts for free, because the students had to perform in so many concerts a year. And I took them to see Vaughan Williams' The Lark Ascending.
I love that. That's
I do too. And I'm telling you, and this girl who, she was probably 22 or something, who was the violinist, you could feel the entire audience just with her.
Mhm.
I mean, it was palpable, and it was a beautiful experience. In
Yeah,
fact,
when it's done with just violin and piano, I think it's even more powerful. Like that's like, yeah,
yeah,
that's how it was originally written.
yeah, and it's
that's fantastic.
and I think Vaughan Williams, for instance, half the Anglican hymn book was written by him. I had no idea. You ever hear "All Creatures of Our God and King," which is a
Right.
beautiful hymn. I didn't realize he wrote the lyric. We wrote the music for it.
Yeah.
And he was so plugged into English folk traditions.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think
Yes.
reveal the Sophianic. And I think those kinds of folk traditions, whether it's dancing around a maypole or all kind, llamas bread or whatever it happens to be, and other kinds of folk traditions as well, they're still connected to the natural world, and to the Sophianic.
Mhm.
Yeah, that like we've been on our channel, we've been going through chapter by chapter, ML Book's commentary on the Apocalypse of John, and like early on in that he talks about like he's giving his interpretation of the letters to the churches,
Right.
and he views like his interpretation of what the first love that the Church of Ephesus has lost is the love of the earth. Right.
Like
so
that.
that's like in a lot of ways, like we're in the same state as the Church of Ephesus.
And the technocracy makes it even worse, right?
Yeah.
Tries to herd us into the virtual environments and spend more and more time like little kids, right? Who spend how many hours on a tablet?
Oh, yeah, it's true.
I mean, that
Yeah.
So concerning.
One of our mutual friends in this little like online community that we participate in told a harrowing story the other day about one of his like younger like cousins who was being asked to look at a sunset or a sunrise, and she's like she said that the sun takes too long to download.
Yeah,
it's boring.
I don't have the
it
code.
takes too long to download. So that just like, and for that's particularly crushing to hear that coming from a child, right? And I think that like this sort of like lockdown process that we've been through has really like exacerbated that. Unfortunately, like I have a little niece who's about 5, and I don't like, she's very much is like very active, loves to be outside, doesn't seem to have impacted her very much. But I'm sure there are lots of kids who that's had like a very negative.
Oh, I know it. It's traumatizing.
Yeah.
It doesn't. My 2 youngest are, I know how they're 10 and 12. So we homeschool though, so they haven't had to be subjected to that.
Right.
So
well, I mean, if the Sophianic is about a reciprocal awakening, which is what it sounds like to me, right? Then if you're staring at a tablet, your attention it's
not going to
you completely, you've killed it, right? There is there's no opportunity. Like I talk about this experience I had, my blueberry experience, where when I first moved here, I looked for blueberries. I couldn't find any. So I said, oh, there's no blueberries. There's no blueberries here. That was my statement of the day, right? Okay. We live in a semi-arid place. So I just assumed that there were no blueberries here. And I don't know how many years ago, I'd already been living here maybe 15 years. And I would walk with my goats on the property, and they would always gravitate to wetter areas because of the shrubbery, right? And one day I happened to look down and I saw a blueberry, and I was like, what? And just that experience of finding, then I saw blueberries everywhere, right? There were just blueberries everywhere. And I felt like what it taught me was how limited my attention had been up to that point. Like I was just focusing, like I was, getting up, looking at my boots, looking at my jacket, looking at my feet while I walked up to the barn, looking at the pitchfork, looking at the hay, I didn't look around.
Yeah, right? I go through the same thing. I have to remind myself.
Yeah. Look around. look around.
Because you have so much other stuff to do. I gotta get out, I gotta do this, and I have to do that,
Yeah,
right? But
Yeah.
then to be present.
yeah.
is-
And that's what walking the goats was. I just loved it, because I would just sit, right, and be present and watch them and look around and look at the ground and see flowers I never saw before. I remember finding a dogwood tree for the first time here. I said to my husband, we have dogwood trees. Like, I looked it up in the book, and I'm like,
I wonder how much of that comes out of our perpetual sense of busyness, though, which is also obviously exacerbated by the technology.
yeah. And I mean, think about it, Nate. Like, I actually have a lot of time, and I'm in a setting where I could be paying attention, and I still don't, right? So you put someone in a city situation where they don't even have it really, they're not even stimulated to look around. Like, there's no stimulation. And then they're in front of their phones. Like, there's an entire cosmos just passing them by, right? Completely passing them by.
But yeah, but I mean, you have an answer. I think it's in, you have a great quote. I think it's in Incarnation of the Poetic Word, where you have, I think it's from, who is it from? It's one of the Neoplatonists. Maybe you can help me out here. But it talks about contemplation as a game.
Yeah.
Do you remember which Neoplatonist it was you were
I
quoting?
think it was Plotinus.
Plotinus, that's right. Yes, it was Plotinus. Yes, that's right. And so if you're going about life with this sense of busyness, like, there's no room for play.
Right.
No.
So it's hard to contemplate. It's hard to participate. There's no way that's not going to impoverish your being. Like, I don't see how it couldn't.
Yeah, you have to cultivate reverie.
Right.
Yeah, which is
we have ravens here, and they do spectacular things, and I always want to know why. So I get my Raven book out and I look it up, and it says in there's very little known about the raven, right? And I'm like, why? It's always in there. It's always right there, right in your face, right? But that's why. Because it's right there and you don't pay attention.
Well, but how we watch matters too, though, right? So that's like the thing. Like, this is actually kind of ties back to what Michael was saying earlier about, like, the way Goethe was trying to do science as opposed to the way we've done science after the scientific revolution. It's like, there's always a utilitarian sort of goal in mind. Like, no one is going to just go out and, like, watch ravens for the sake of watching ravens and communing with the ravens. Like, that's not going to happen.
yeah.
I do. Yeah. No, it's kind of like, even if you live in a city, if you took a walk, if you walk to work, let's say, or walk to the grocery store instead of driving, you would see the patterns. There would be some animal, there would be some plant that would reveal a pattern to you that you would, if you were going every day and paying attention, you would see the pattern, and that pattern speaks volumes, right? And but people, I mean, aside from the phones and all the rest of it, even in 1912, they didn't pay attention because they were focused on where they were going, or they were thinking about this, the ill-fitting shoe that they were wearing, or whatever the case might be, right? And this is the interesting thing. Like, I read that last time we did the Emile book thing, about the thing I wrote about the human being, and with the eyes in front of the face, right? And the lack of peripheral vision.
Right.
And it's just, it's a trait that we have, right, as human beings. And you have to cultivate it. Like, you actually have to, it's a practice, right, to observe.
It's a meditative practice, is what it is.
It is.
It's contemplation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My sister lives with First Nations, and they took the elders up to this place where they used to dig up a root. It's called Potato Mountain, and they call it a wild potato, but it's just a tuberous wild plant. And they took the elders up there, and the elders were teaching the young people how to find these plants, right? And where to find them. And they were often, you know, down on the ground, focused on digging, right? And the elders would say to the young people, look around, right? So then the young people would stop digging and they'd be like this, looking. And they'd say, no, 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 look around. You have to keep digging, but you also have to look around. And they were teaching them this valuable way of perceiving, you know, around them. And I've been around, you know, older First Nations, and they see everything. Like I have a nephew who's First Nations. He's married to my niece, and man, you know, I'll be in the kitchen busy. There'll be like 16 people in the room, and I'll, you know, drop a fork or something, and he'll say, "You need me to get you a new one, Auntie?" And I'll think, he saw that? Like he sees everything, you know, he sees that, he just sees everything. It's a different way of looking, you know.
What can you characterize what you think the difference is?
Oh, or well, there's, you know, the lifestyle.
I have a thought.
Okay,
Go
yeah,
for it,
let's
Michael.
hear it.
You've been quiet. I want to hear from you.
I think what we were talking about in this Sophiology, I don't know, way of attentiveness towards the world is there's something at the base of it that is like a sort of belief about the world being alive, right? So that it actually matters, right? Because it seems like, I guess in some of this Gnostic stuff that seems to be everywhere, you know, that we're talking about, it seems to be a sort of encouragement to see the world around us as sort of virtual and not real, and kind of have that as the base mode, like, so that we're like the things that immediately present themselves to us, we immediately discount as sort of being sort of virtual and not real, and we kind of push it away, and we're like looking, we're hungry for truth, we're hungry for the real, but we're like searching for it at like these like weird abstract layers, you know. And it seems like what we're talking about here, one of the main sociological insights is that this sort of conduit to the divine, such that God really is present in all these things, and such that, you know, it makes sense to pay attention to these things, because within them is something that's alive, that's actually trying to speak to you.
Yes.
That really matters.
Yeah.
So is the difference just thinking that there's something to see in the first place? Is that the?
There's always something to see. Yeah, that could be it.
But something's trying to talk to you. Something wants to make itself known to you. And yeah. And when you're talking earlier about like how, you know, you have that expression when you encounter a person, there's something of the divine there anytime. So it's like, in some sense, anytime you know any person deeply, you know the person of persons, like, is somehow revealed in that, right? And so there's like this, I don't know, it's a weird sense. Again, like I don't have good articulation for it, but like it's a sense you have sometimes where, again, you know, you feel,
Well, I think
you feel a sense that something's reaching out to you, like you're attending to something, but you feel like something's actually trying to make its own effort to make itself known to you. And there's a participatory element to that, because like you have to kind of stay in that mode, but it's also, if you try and grasp at it too quickly, like it's you can feel yourself just kill the moment, right? You know, so there's a sort of like, there's a certain passivity you have to put yourself into with the active attention, you know. It's like both simultaneously, like what you were talking about earlier, where they're digging but also looking around. It's like, it's kind of like the two things at once.
Yeah. Well, that's why I love the idea of reciprocity. Like that's what you're talking about right there, you know, is that it's trying to speak to you too, right? Like I always say to people, they'll say to me, well, you have such a gift with animals. And I said, well, that's because I listen. It's not because they it's not that I've made a scientific observation and I know how they function. They're actually talking, right? And if you just listen, they'll talk more because they're like, oh, she can hear us, right? I've put it in terms that, if somebody walked up to you and spoke Romanian and you just looked at them with a blank stare, they would stop talking to you. And that's how it is with animals. They come up and they speak goose or cow or goat. And if you don't get it, they just walk away. They're like, helpless, it's helpless. They're not listening, and they're eternally patient with us, actually.
Well, it doesn't come down to like the mode in which you're attending, right? So it's like if you're attending to something, as an object, it's not going to present yourself to you as anything other than an object.
Right.
And you're only going to see it in an objective context.
I have a question that comes out of that. So this is kind of big and abstract theological question, but it's something that kind of, I don't know, I'm semi-obsessed with, I guess. And where it seems to me that Sophiology has something to say about the way in which God condescends to all things, right? That he's, actually fully present in all these things. And I'm curious, Michael, if you see any, I don't know, I've always had this sort of problem with divine impassibility, because it seems to me to come out of a certain like Greek mode of thinking of the perfect as this sort of static, unchangeable thing.
Right.
And I'm curious what you think about what Sophiology has to teach about maybe that.
Well, I don't think it's involved with that at all.
Okay.
I think in Sophiology, clearly God suffers when we suffer. Well, otherwise, who needs a God that does it? You know what I mean? You talk about the compassionate father. Well, you're a compassionate father and your child's going through suffering, you're suffering as well, right? Mm-hmm. And if your child has a triumph, you're also ecstatic. So I don't think that's how it works. And I think that as much as I appreciate Plotinus and Neoplatonism, I think the fathers were trying too hard to gain philosophical street cred in the early part of the church in order to, does Christ suffer? It's not too hard, right?
Yeah.
No, does he weep for Jerusalem? Is he not the second person of the Trinity? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of silly, right? And I think that's it's even worse in Christianity with scholasticism, especially neo-scholasticism, right? Which tries to turn God into a concept, or a structure or something.
Yeah.
Something in a test tube. And I think I think what Sophiology offers is experience. So kind of in a way, it's practical mysticism in a way. It's not carried away kind of mysticism.
Yeah.
Kind of, because let's face it, some mysticism reads like psychosis, right? But Sophiology just seems to be a very practical kind of mysticism. That's attentive to the world, and that, like we said before, right? That through which God reveals or just discloses the real. And the thing is, once you start to do that, you want to keep doing it. You want to do it as often as possible. And of course, you don't live in a perfect, like a constant state of that kind of Sophianic ecstasy. But like we said before, it's something that you cultivate. And you have to, it becomes part of your practice as a human being, is try to remind yourself to attend to that. Because it will happen. Now, and as you were saying too, Michael, and I was thinking this right before you said it, there's the grasping part, right? You want to grasp it. Like the story of the Holy Grail, where the knight goes to grab it, and then he's wounded, right? So how do you do this without grasping? How do you hold it without hands, right? And because it's like almost like the fairy tales about leprechaun gold. As soon as you go to pick it up, it disappears, right? As soon as you try to possess it, it's gone. But you already possess it. And this is actually, for me, this is the great lesson I take from Thomas Traherne, the metaphysical poet, who his poetry is just a meditation on becoming like a child and entering the kingdom of heaven. And what he says is, all things were mine when I was a child. You know, the sun was mine, the stars were mine, all fields were mine, all people were mine, right? And because he wasn't trying to grasp them or hold them or imprison them, right? So I think that's why I think Traherne is a beautifully Sophianic poet, and so is Henry Vaughan, the other metaphysical poet. And when you see with those two, I'm sure, well, I know in Vaughan's case, I know it's a fact, and I'm sure it happened with Traherne as well. Those very little stuff out there that he wrote about says, I read this book. But what happened is in the 1620s and 30s, the works of Jakob Böhme were translated into English. And they kind of reset Christian mysticism, especially in England at the time, and through parts of Germany as well, because it was a different kind of mysticism. It was not the kind of emotive mysticism that you might find in Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross, you know, that's really attentive to suffering, right? Participating in the suffering of the Lord. Where this other kind of mysticism is like Traherne, it's an entrance into the beauty of the world, right? Yeah. Which to me, that seems a much more psychologically healthy approach.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile that with like some of the things, like some of like the Christian like hostility to the world? I wonder what you would have to say to that. And then the other thing, what like two things. And the other thing I wanted to say is, like, you're talking about Traherne and the idea of, like, you know, a mysticism of like recovering this childhood. To me, that really maps on very well to Owen Barfield's idea of participation, where like original participation would have just been like, it can be psychologically mapped onto the innocent participation of early childhood,
right?
And we hope to, like, as we progress, like culturally in our cultural evolution of consciousness and in our own evolution of consciousness toward a final participation where we can recover that and have like the wisdom of age, which also reminds me of Douglas Harding's like 4 stages of life. But yeah, go ahead, and if you have anything to say about that, like about the whole world concept.
Reorient me. What do you want me to talk about?
No, sorry. Yeah, I know. I was like, I had like 4 different things I wanted to say at the same time. Like, so like the traditional Christian hostility toward the world.
Let's take that one first.
How would we reconcile that with Sophiology? I think that's a big question that a lot of people are going to have.
I think Margaret Barker discusses this in her book on creation, for instance, that the original idea was that the temple was creation itself.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't know how we got off the rails.
Yeah.
You know, and Barker also argues that that's what the early church was doing. You know, that what she argues is that what happened with the reforms of King Josiah in, I think, the 7th century BC, he straightened up, you know, it was like what do you call it? Like an encyclical came out, and he's kind of, or a council, a church council, where he straightened everything out in the synagogue. And what happened is they, according to her interpretation, the Jewish authorities kicked Sophia Hokmah out of the temple. And so there were some Israelites who did not want to play that game. So they went in exile, there's a word for it, right? To North Africa in Alexandria. And that's where the wisdom books were written. right? And so the wisdom books emphasize Sophia,
Mm.
and they emphasize creation, right? I think another wisdom book, the Song of Songs, for instance, there's nothing about sin or God, for that matter, in that book. But it's holy, in that it reveals our intimacy with not only with the beloved, but with God and with the world, right? And there's so many. When you just think of that poem, how many images taken from nature inhabit that, right? And I think those kinds of things are trying to tell us the right way to be oriented to the world. And I think the church suffered from that. I think from the earliest time, because the influence of the Neoplatonism on the fathers, where there was this kind of rejection of the body as not whole, not good, or not wholesome, or some way, right? But then you go through church history and you get to the 12th century, and who shows up in the 12th century but St. Francis, who kind of hits the reset button on what it means to be a Christian, even though he still maintains some of that, self-abnegation and stuff like this. But brother, sun, sister, moon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and also at the same time, the 12th century was when the rosary appeared on the scene, right? Where Gothic architecture let light into the church. So it's kind of a beautiful moment. And I think you see over the course of church history, those beautiful moments, which are Sophianic moments, as far as I'm concerned, the troubadours, show up every once in a while to remind the people the unhappy people how it's supposed to be, and I think this is what Soloviev was doing in the Orthodox Church in the latter part of the 19th century.
What would you think about the idea of maybe contrasting world when it's used in the negative sense in Christian language, and creation as reflecting different modes of relating to the same thing?
Well, there's the cosmos and there's the world, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is where it touches on this is what Gnosticism was talking about. When they say, and we can look around right now, and I think this is why there's so much Gnosticism bubbling about the culture right now, because we live in a kind of Gnostic hell, right? We're an unreal world, and we want to be free from it. We want to break free from it and be connected once again to the real, which is, like I said, in the Hymn of the Pearl does that. And so we have all of this unreality surrounding us, and the history of the church is, I think this is inescapable when you have power structures, with really powerful power structures. It's even happens in low level power structures, but I think once you get somebody trying to control things and orchestrate how people are allowed to experience, in the book Sophia in Exile, in the chapter on marriage, is precisely about this. Because marriage, when I was a kid in Catholic school, it was like, it wasn't really presented, but it was presented as the booby prize. You can't be a priest or a nun.
Yeah.
You'll have to be married, but that's okay too, which is garbage, right? It's nonsense. Well, the only reason that exists is because the monastics created the church in their image. Just like you were talking earlier, Nate, about your English professor. This is how power structures work. Even if people talk about why do people in the English departments argue so much? Because the stakes are so low, right?
Yeah.
And people want. People want, that childhood experience, that the intuition we all have as children about who God is and what the world is. I think that it's true of everyone. And then you kind of get weighed down with whether it's theory or theological school or whatever it happens to be. And this is why we talked earlier, right? Sociology is so like phenomenology, because it kind of starts over afresh and says, okay, let's bracket all of these assumptions about what we think God is and what theology is, and experience what's before us without trying to grasp it. And I think when you do that, it's the beautiful that is revealed.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know. I like in a lot of our conversations, this idea that like we've been culturally obsessed with the true at the expense of the good and the beautiful,
Right.
like to such an extent that like I think like beauty has to be our pathway toward a more unified truth where the good, the beautiful, and the true are actually coinciding again. I was just thinking, like, I think part of like what's going on here is like why there's a resistance to this kind of like Sophianic turn is that we have a structure of Christianity that, to put it in Barfieldian terms, we have a structure of Christianity that grew up in the withdrawal participation. And it very much has convinced itself that withdrawal participation is a good thing because the risk of idolatry
and
it's like, oh no, we can't make that participatory turn because if we do, that's idolatry.
And that's, like Jacques Ellul, who I love, about technology, but I can't get past his Calvinist suspicion of images and beauty, right? But you're mentioning, so I think one of the foundational Catholic documents of Sophiology in the 20th century was it's Hans Urs von Balthasar's The Glory of the Lord, Volume 1.
Right.
And I think, I can't remember exactly, but the first words are something like, beauty will be our starting point.
Yeah.
And the first 100 pages of that introduction are just, when I read it, I was like, did you drop from heaven? I've been looking for this.
Teilhard de Chardin's Mass on the World seems incredibly.
That too, isn't it great?
Too.
Wow, that when I read that, and that's exactly what we're talking. And I think his what's it called? The Eternal Feminine, which I put in The Heavenly Country. It's one of the more beautiful pieces of prose. And Thomas Merton did it as well, right? With Hagia Sophia.
Right.
Extraordinary. And it's there. And that's why I ended the Submerged Reality with Catholic Sophiology at the end. Because Catholics were kind of Johnny-come-latelys about Sophiology, but they got there, right? And I think that they got most of it from the Russians.
Yeah, and I think you suggest, I can't remember which of you, I've read several of your books at this point, so I can't remember which one it is, but there's actually like one of your books, you like make the suggestion that like that Sophiology, now that it's like entered into the West, might actually have a better chance of catching on in the West than it did in the East, because those traditions of that ascetic mysticism are so deeply ingrained in Eastern Christianity that it's a tough turn for it to make.
Yeah, and I think it's, my experience. So I heard from you, and I hear from people. In fact, I got an email from a Cistercian monk. No, he was a Capuchin monk the other day, who also has found, and it's not like I'm doing anything special in these books, but I'm just kind of describing things as I see them. But people, I've encountered from all over the world go, yes, this is what we're looking for. Mm-hmm. We want a wholesome spirituality that's not burdened by self-hate.
Well, I think your view of Sophiology is like broader than most people who are talking about it, which I really appreciate about your work. It's like you're not focused on like, say, just the Russians, for example. It's you're finding all these sociological strains from all over the place, and you're bringing them together. And then not only that, then you're like, okay, this is what this means, and this is what we can do with it, and this is why it's important.
Yeah,
so
that's it, because it's something you do. I mean, if it's not something you do, it's really worthless. It's just another theoretical construct.
Right.
If it can't be lived, it's not worth even investing any time in.
Very true.
That's a typical farmer statement right there.
Yeah, it is. It is. If it ain't real, it ain't real.
What are we gonna do with this? Can we do something with it?
Yeah.
I feel like that about everything too. Like, I've heard people have long discussions about theoretical stuff, and then I'll say, so what are you going to do with all that?
Yeah.
Right.
And they're like, oh, I don't know.
Well, when I first got into biodynamic farming 30 years ago, I was in a study group with a couple of people, and we're reading about all these biodynamic preparations and Steiner's agriculture course.
Yeah.
And we got done. I said, now what? We should do this. We should make some of these things. And they're like, well, I don't know if we could really do that. That would be. Well, I'm doing it. So actually, this is when we're living in that little postage stamp garden in Michigan, or Ferndale, Michigan. And I found places that would send me cow horns and sheep skulls. And they're sending to me, and I'd get these boxes from UPS that were bleeding. And our roommate, he kept saying, next time the Jehovah's Witnesses come out, I'm going to come out with the box and say, where do you want this sheep skull? Yeah. But I wanted to do it, right? I didn't just want to think about it.
Absolutely.
It's got to be,
you don't learn anything. You don't learn anything if you don't do it, right?
Got to be incarnated.
Yeah.
Taking on the flesh.
Yeah. You said something about the grasping and how you're always trying to grasp, but then you have this childlikeness that just says, this is all mine, right? And I thought to myself, isn't it grasping you then at that point?
Yes.
Right. It's cradling you.
Yeah.
Right. Which is kind of the image of the Theotokos that I have, right? Of this Mother Earth that is cradling, holding.
Yeah.
And you can't possess it, but it can possess you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
And Nate, you were asking, like, how come this isn't, catching on or anything? I wonder, because it's so tied in with childlikeness, or some people would interpret that as childishness, right? But it's not, as childlikeness. I think that a lot of people just see it as silly.
Yep.
Right? Silly.
It's like rock and roll.
Yeah.
It is. I remember reading an interview with Paul Simon, right?
Okay.
And Paul Simon's father was a jazz musician. And he said, my dad couldn't understand rock and roll. He just thought it was too simple. And I said, Dad, it is simple, but you have to know what to do with the simplicity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think Sophiology, it sounds naive, but and that's, people try to dismiss Thomas Traherne as a kind of Pollyanna, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But he's not. He's the most profound philosopher, the most profound theologian, because he gives you the key to get back into the garden.
Yeah.
It's all
I don't know anything about him, but is
he?
he from the Romantic period?
He's a metaphysical poet.
He's earlier.
Earlier.
Yeah.
Because
17th century.
Yeah.
there's a critique from Barfield about the Romantic period as being not brought to maturity.
Right.
It really bummed me out when I read that.
But you know what? That's what he. But he said.
But he wants it. He sees the potential. Though. That's why he says that.
He says what?
I said he sees the potential in it. That's why he says that.
Well, that's what he thinks. He calls it in his essay, "Romanticism Comes of Age."
Yeah.
Okay.
In anthroposophy for him.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know the rest.
And that's true. I mean, I think the Romantics did run out of gas.
Yeah.
But in fact, next semester, I'm teaching a course on love and romanticism. I can't wait. It's so much fun. But they had the intuitions, right?
They did.
They didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Novalis did, but he died at 30 or 29.
Yeah.
Goethe did. The English Romantics, they had the intuition, but of course, Keats died at 25.
Yeah.
Wordsworth became a cranky old man. Coleridge became a drug addict, right? But they had as young men, they had the intuition, and they were responding to the Enlightenment and the deadness of the Enlightenment. Kind of like, Sophiology at this moment responds to the technocracy,
right?
The harmonic, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And God bless them for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't really see any other. I honestly don't see anything else that even offers the possibility of rescuing us from the machine. It's like I don't see another way out.
No,
and I think you can see that in some of Barfield's darker musings. I think he sees that too. So I mean, it's what do you think about that, Michael?
I think so, but you know, he was an anthroposophist, and you know, Steiner was doing a kind of Sophiology.
Yeah.
You know, especially if you think, you know, I always think with Steiner, it's when he talks about Sophiology or Sophia, it's much, you know, tends to be abstract, though there are some real nuggets in there. But when he it's his practical stuff is Sophiology, the education.
Yeah.
Right. I was a Waldorf teacher for 16 years, and trust me, it's magical the way it works on those kids.
Yeah, it is.
Right.
And biodynamic farming. So these are kind of practical sociological.
I don't know if you've encountered this book, but you might want to check it out. This is actually by Emil Bach, who's like a Steiner
I know
associated figure. This
Yeah.
is the Threefold Mary. This is like, I think this is like quite sociological.
I don't have that one. I have a couple of his books.
Yeah.
Check it out.
But yeah. So I actually have a question. So you know, and I think you mentioned this in your new book too, Bulgakov's meditation on the Grail. Like when he talks about blood in that, it's like, did he read Steiner or did they just come to?
That's what I thought.
It sounds so much like Steiner.
Well,
like,
I know. Well, he was good friends with Berdyaev, right? And Berdyaev actually attended lectures by Steiner.
Okay.
So I'm sure he knew about him.
And
And
Bulgakov has a tendency to not necessarily cite everything.
Especially things that are going to make the Archbishop get upset, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if he knew about Steiner.
It sure does sound like it. So
that's it. I mean, you know, think about that as we farmers.
Right.
The blood of Christ touched the earth. So when we work with that earth, we're working indirectly or directly with the blood of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That rejuvenated the world. I mean, that's Steiner's thing, is it rejuvenated the
Well,
earth.
it also it really reflects this whole like kind of Eucharistic vision of the entire cosmos, this whole being as communion idea, which again, like which would definitely tie into Teilhard de Chardin's thinking as well. I mean, it's like there's a lot of resonance there.
Yeah. Yeah, that Holy Grail book by Bulgakov is this is the first thing I read by him, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, really? Okay.
A long time ago. But actually, 20 or 30 years ago, there was almost nothing available by Bulgakov in English.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't until really Rowan Williams kind of almost single-handedly like brought Bulgakov to salience in the West.
So thank God he did.
Yeah, thank God he did.
Seriously.
Thank God for a lot of things Rowan Williams does. He's a beautiful man.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, yeah.
He also translated von Balthasar.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, do either of you have any more questions that you want to ask?
No, I'm good.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fantastic conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah,
this has been our special guest, Dr. Michael Martin, author of many books, which I'll make sure to put links to in the description. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Martin.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure. God bless you all.
Yeah, you too.